Imagine, for just a second, that you are put in charge of saving the global wild bird population from this catastrophic extinction event.
Right, a massive undertaking.
Exactly. So the hawks, the songbirds, the owls, they're all dying out. And your grand, heavily funded solution to this is to breed 2 billion domestic farm chickens and just release them into the woods.
Which is, I mean, objectively hilarious to picture.
Right. It sounds completely absurd. It sounds like a plan that would actually make the problem much, much worse. But as we were going to find out today, that is almost exactly what humanity is currently doing to save the bees.
Yeah, it really is a phenomenal paradox. I mean, we have focused almost all of our cultural anxiety, our legislation, our conservation efforts on an agricultural animal.
A farm animal, basically.
Exactly. And in doing so, we are completely missing the silent collapse of the actual foundational architecture of our natural world.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are exploring a massive, slightly terrifying question. What happens if bees disappear?
Yeah, it's a heavy one.
It is. We want to understand the hidden system that is quite literally keeping us alive. And to do that, we are pulling from a massive stack of sources today.
A really comprehensive stack.
We've got United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization models, insights from the National Geographic docuseries, Secrets of the Bees, comprehensive assessments from the IPBES, which tracks global biodiversity, and a whole bunch of university entomology lab reports.
It's a lot of data to synthesize, for sure.
It is. But the mission here is to look past the slogans, past the T-shirts, to uncover what these creatures actually do. We want to debunk the famous apocalyptic myths about their disappearance and figure out how a tiny insect holds up the entire global economy.
And setting the tone for this exploration is, it's really crucial right up front.
Oh, definitely.
Because this isn't a deep dive designed to leave you in a state of ecological despair, It is not about impending doom.
Yeah.
We are looking at a complex, co-evolved mutualism that has existed for millions of years.
Right, a system of relationships.
Yeah. And by the end of this conversation, you will understand the intricate mechanics of how human nutrition, economic stability, and just the structural integrity of nature itself are all tied to the behaviors of an insect with a brain the size of a sesame seed.
A sesame seed? That is wild.
It is. And the goal here is to replace panic with profound awareness.
Okay, I love that. So to get to that awareness, we kind of have to skip the basic middle school biology textbook definitions.
Right. We can skip the birds and the bees talk.
Exactly. We all generally know that plants need pollen transferred to reproduce. But I want to understand why the bee is the ultimate protagonist in this system. Like, why are they so much more effective than the wind or a butterfly or a bird that just, happens to brush past a flower?
Well, it really comes down to intent versus accident.
Intent versus accident. How so?
Think about an incidental pollinator. So a butterfly, a hummingbird, or even a fly. They are visiting a flower strictly to consume nectar.
Just looking for a snack?
Right. Nectar is their high-octane flight fuel. If a few grains of pollen happen to stick to their bodies and get carried to the next flower, it's a happy accident for the plant.
But the butterfly couldn't care less.
Exactly. The butterfly is just there for the sugar. And wind pollination is even less targeted. It's a pure numbers game where a plant just throws millions of pollen grains into the air.
Just hoping one lands in the right microscopic spot.
Yeah, which is highly inefficient.
So what changes when a bee enters the equation?
Well, a bee isn't just looking for personal flight fuel. A bee is actively hunting for pollen because pollen is the primary protein-dense food source they need to develop their larvae.
Oh, so it's baby food.
Essentially, yes. They are intentionally foraging for the foundational nutrition of their entire next generation. So they don't want to just brush past it. They want to harvest it in massive quantities.
Okay, but I know pollen is incredibly sticky, right? Almost like a microscopic burr.
Very sticky, yeah. So how does a bee physically gather enough of it to feed thousands of developing larvae without just clumsily rubbing against everything and making a mess?
This is where the physics of their biology becomes truly mesmerizing. It involves electrostatic force.
Wait, static electricity? Like rubbing a balloon on your head?
Exactly like that. Think about an insect beating its wings hundreds of times per second as it flies through the air.
Okay.
That rapid movement creates immense friction with the surrounding air molecules. So just like the balloon strips away electrons and creates a static charge, a bee in flight builds up a significant positive electrostatic charge.
Oh, wow. And the flower has a negative charge.
Exactly, because a flower is physically grounded in the earth it carries a negative electrical charge.
That is so cool.
Right. So you have this highly positively charged bee approaching a negatively charged flower. The bee doesn't even have to physically touch every single grain of pollen.
Wait, really? It just pulls it in? Yeah. As it hovers or lands, that static electrical field acts like a magnet. The pollen grains literally jump through the air, snapping onto the bee's fuzzy body.
That is incredible. They're essentially a microscopic, static-charged dust mop, just pulling material toward them before they even make contact.
A very aggressive dust mop, yes. But once they are covered in the statically attracted pollen, they still have to transport it back to the hive.
Right, they can't just fly around covered in dust.
No, so bees possess specialized stiff hairs on their legs. They will briefly hover or rest on a petal and rapidly groom themselves.
Like a cat grooming itself.
Sort of. They use these stiff hairs to comb the pollen down their bodies, mixing it with a tiny bit of nectar to make it sticky, and then they pack it tightly into specialized pockets on their hind legs.
The pollen baskets.
Yes, and entomologists call them corpiculi, but yeah, pollen baskets.
But wait, if they pack it all away into baskets, the plant still gets what it wants, right? Because the bee can't possibly comb every single grain into those baskets.
Precisely. The grooming is never 100% efficient.
Just enough gets left behind.
Yeah, enough pollen remains caught in the microscopic hairs on their head and thorax so that when they land on the next flower, the physical contact transfers the genetic material, completing the pollination process.
There is another behavioral trait mentioned in the research that seems, entirely counterintuitive for an animal trying to gather as much food as possible.
You're talking about floral constancy.
Yes. Why would a foraging bee deliberately ignore perfectly good flowers right next to the ones it's feeding on?
Yeah, floral constancy is an evolutionary masterpiece of mutual benefit. When a bee leaves the nest for a foraging trip, she tends to focus exclusively on one specific species of flower for the duration of that flight.
So she starts her morning on apple blossoms.
She will actively bypass the dandelions, the clover, the cherry blossoms, even traveling further distances just to find more apple blossoms.
Which just seems like a massive waste of energy for the bee. There's food right there.
It definitely seems that way, but it is actually chemically highly efficient.
Oh, so?
Every plant's pollen and nectar have a different chemical composition. By sticking to one type, the bee's digestive system and the colony's processing mechanisms don't have to constantly adjust to different biochemical inputs.
Oh, I see. And the benefit to the plant is obvious. If a bee drops apple pollen onto a dandelion, it's useless, right? The genetic material is wasted.
Exactly. By practicing floral constancy, the bee acts as a dedicated, hyper-reliable courier service. It guarantees that the apple pollen ends up exactly where it needs to be on another apple blossom.
It guarantees successful cross-pollination.
Yes. And when you zoom out from the individual bee and look at a honeybee colony, you realize this level of hyperspecialization exists on a macro scale as well. The colony itself functions as a superorganism.
That's superorganism. How does the biological definition of a superorganism differ from just, a really cooperative group of animals, like a wolf pack or a flock of birds?
A superorganism is an entity where the individual parts cannot survive on their own. They function identically to the organs in a human body.
Okay, so a wolf can technically live alone, but a bee can't.
Right. You don't look at a human heart or a liver and think of it as an independent animal. In a honeybee hive, the queen is not the ruler, she is simply the reproductive organ.
Oh, just an organ.
Yes. The male drones are the genetic vectors, and the tens of thousands of female worker bees are the hands, the stomach, the immune system, and the sensory organs.
That's a fascinating way to look at it.
It is. They are bound together not by individual consciousness, but by a complex network of chemical pheromones that basically act as the colony's nervous system.
And that collective nervous system is entirely focused on resource management and survival. The data detailing how they prepare for winter is staggering.
It really is.
Like they possess a level of foresight and ruthless efficiency that makes modern human supply chains look completely amateurish.
Oh, they are the ultimate practitioners of sustainability. Throughout the spring and summer, the superorganism calculates exactly how much honey, which is their carbohydrate energy source, they will need to survive the months when there are no blooming flowers.
So they aggressively stockpile.
They do. But as autumn approaches, they run a really cruel but necessary mathematical equation.
The drone eviction.
Yeah, the drone eviction. It's brutal.
Explain how that works, because it's wild.
So the male drones exist solely to mate with a virgin queen from another hive. That's it. They do not forage, they do not defend the hive, and they do not tend to the young.
But they eat.
They consume a massive amount of honey. So, to ensure the superorganism survives the winter, the female worker bees will systematically force the drones out of the hive.
Just kick them out into the cold.
Literally. They will bite their wings and drag them to the entrance to freeze or starve to death. The collective must survive, even if it means sacrificing a specific subset of its population.
It is pure, brutal survival math. But I guess that relentless drive to gather resources is exactly what makes them the structural pillar of our global food system.
Absolutely.
The phrase that appears in almost every FAO and agricultural report we looked at is that 1 in 3 bites of food you eat relies on pollinators.
1 in 3.
I want to visualize what that actually looks like on a global scale.
Let's walk through a typical grocery store to visualize it. If pollinators were removed from the equation, the produce section would look like a post-apocalyptic wasteland.
Just empty shelves.
Almost empty. Approximately 84% of all commercial crop species grown globally have increased yields from insect pollination. When you look at the top 115 food crops worldwide, bees support the production of 87 of them.
So we're talking about what? Apples, cherries, blueberries, melons, pumpkins.
Exactly. And certain massive industries are entirely dependent on them. Take the California almond industry, for example.
Oh, right, the almond milk craze.
Yeah, it's a multi-billion-dollar economic engine, and it requires 100% insect pollination. An almond tree cannot produce a single nut without a pollinator physically moving the pollen.
0 almonds without bees.
0.
I noticed an unexpected connection in the agricultural data regarding dairy, actually. It isn't just the fruit and nut aisles that are impacted.
No, it goes much deeper.
Right, so if I'm buying a block of cheddar cheese or a gallon of milk, how on earth is a bee involved in that?
It all comes down to the forage crops fed to the livestock. High-yielding dairy cows require highly nutritious feed to produce milk at commercial volumes.
Okay, so they aren't just eating plain grass.
Right. One of the primary components of that feed is alfalfa. And alfalfa is a complex flower that is notoriously difficult to pollinate.
Why is it difficult?
It requires the heavy lifting of specific pollinators, like the leafcutter bee and managed honeybees, to trip the flower and produce the seeds. Those seeds are necessary to grow the vast fields of alfalfa that dairy farmers rely on.
Wow. So without the bees, the alfalfa seed market collapses.
And when that collapses, the dairy feed becomes nutritionally deficient and milk production plummets. So your cheese is directly tied to the bees.
You are describing a massive economic and agricultural web here. The U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates that insect pollination adds over $34 billion to the U.S. economy annually.
And global estimates range anywhere from $235 billion to $577 billion.
But I want to challenge the existential severity of this for a moment.
Okay, challenge away.
Because if we look strictly at the data regarding human caloric intake, roughly 60% of the total volume of food grown worldwide does not require animal pollination.
That's accurate, yes.
We are talking about the massive global staple crops, right? Wheat, rice, and corn. These are wind-pollinated or self-pollinating.
Correct.
So if humanity isn't going to literally starve to death because we still have endless fields of grain, why is the loss of pollinators treated as an existential crisis?
It is a critical distinction to make. You are correct. From a baseline caloric standpoint, humanity would likely survive the loss of bees.
We'd still have calories.
We would have bread, we would have rice, we would have cornmeal. But there is a massive life-altering gulf between surviving on a monoculture of calories and sustaining true human nutrition.
A monoculture of calories. That implies surviving, but definitely not thriving.
Far from thriving. While the cereal crops provide the bulk of our carbohydrates, the crops that rely on pollinators, the fruits, the nuts, the vegetables, provide the vast majority of our vital micronutrients.
Or vitamins and minerals.
Exactly. Furthermore, pollination doesn't just dictate if a fruit grows, it dictates the biological quality of that fruit.
Wait, how does the amount of pollen change the physical fruit? Like a strawberry is a strawberry, right?
Not at all. Think of a strawberry. A strawberry flower needs hundreds of pollination events to fully develop.
Hundreds for one berry.
Yes. Every single tiny seed on the outside of a strawberry requires a separate grain of pollen to be delivered to the flower.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize each seed needed its own pollen grain.
Yeah, it does. So if a flower receives incomplete pollination, the resulting fruit will be small, misshapen, and chemically deficient.
So a sad, lopsided strawberry.
Exactly. Studies show that a fully bee-pollinated strawberry is physically firmer, redder, has a longer shelf life, and contains higher concentrations of sugar and nutrients.
That's a huge difference.
It is. Without bees, you aren't just losing variety. You are drastically reducing the nutritional density of the foods that keep our immune systems functioning.
Which leads us directly into the apocalyptic scenarios. Because if we establish that we won't starve from a lack of wheat, but we will suffer massive nutritional deficits, we have to address the elephant in the room.
I know where you're going with this.
There is an incredibly famous quote that circulates constantly on social media in articles about ecology. It claims that Albert Einstein said, if the bee disappears from the surface of the earth, man would have no more than 4 years left to live.
The famous 4-year countdown.
Right. It is highly dramatic. It's an incredibly effective hook for a fundraising campaign. And it's completely scientifically and historically false, isn't it?
It is completely false.
So Einstein never said it.
There is absolutely no record of Albert Einstein ever uttering or writing those words. Quote, investigators have traced the origin of that specific attribution to a French magazine published in 1965.
Which was, what, 10 years after he died?
Exactly. The core sentiment of the quote that human survival is tied to insect survival has permutations dating back to a publication in 1901. But human psychology dictates that if we want people to pay attention to an ecological warning, we attach it to the most recognized genius of the 20th century.
It gives authority to our anxieties.
It really does.
But knowing what we just discussed about wind-pollinated wheat and rice, the timeline of a 4-year global human extinction is biologically impossible.
It is impossible. However, the fact that the quote is a myth should not be taken as permission to dismiss the threat entirely.
Right, because the real threat is still there.
The reality isn't a sudden Hollywood-style apocalypse where the sky turns gray and people drop dead in the streets 48 months later. The reality detailed in the IPBES models is much more insidious. It is a slow-motion crisis.
What does that slow-motion crisis look like in the first decade?
Well, the first major human impact is a phenomenon referred to in global health data as hidden hunger.
Hidden hunger.
Yeah. As the global supply of pollinator-dependent fruits and vegetables plummets, the prices of whatever remains will skyrocket.
Which means only the wealthy can afford vitamins.
Basically. Affluent nations might initially absorb this shock through high-tech, incredibly expensive artificial pollination in greenhouses. But for developing nations, the loss of cheap, accessible micronutrients would be catastrophic.
Modeling analysis on global health suggests that in vulnerable areas, up to 50% of the population could become newly at risk for severe vitamin A deficiency.
And vitamin A deficiency causes profound systemic failures in the human body.
Like what?
It leads to night blindness, eventual total blindness, and severely compromises the immune system. You would see populations become highly susceptible to infectious diseases that they previously could have fought off easily.
So it's a massive public health collapse.
Yes. The human cost is measured in widespread malnutrition, spiking disease rates, and global economic instability as food security shatters.
And that is just the fallout for human society. If we look out into the wild ecosystems, the loss of pollinators triggers what ecologists call a trophic cascade.
A very scary term.
Yeah, walk us through the physical mechanics of a trophic cascade. What actually happens to a forest or a meadow if the bees vanish?
A trophic cascade is essentially a structural collapse of a food web from the bottom up. The first domino to fall is the flora.
The plants.
The wildflowers, the blackberry bushes, the wild nut trees, they bloom, but without pollinators, they fail to produce seeds or fruit. They become biological dead ends.
So the plants fail to reproduce. What is the immediate secondary effect of that?
The primary consumers starve.
The animals eating the plants.
Right. The entire layer of the ecosystem that relies on those seeds and berries. The songbirds, the squirrels, the field mice, the diverse insect populations, they find their primary food source has just vanished. Their populations crash rapidly.
Which immediately starves the predators.
Precisely. The secondary and tertiary consumers, the foxes, the hawks, the owls, the bears, suddenly face massive prey scarcity.
So everything just starves.
It does, but the cascade doesn't stop at animal starvation. It actually alters the physical geography of the earth itself.
Wait, how? Because of the root systems?
Exactly. Diverse plant communities act as the biological rebar holding the topsoil together. When those plants die off and fail to replace themselves, the root matrix decays.
Oh, wow. So the ground literally falls apart.
Without roots to anchor the earth, you experience massive soil erosion. The wind simply blows the topsoil away, leading to rapid desertification in arid regions. And in wet regions, without the plants to absorb the rainfall, you get catastrophic, unchecked flooding.
The entire biological infrastructure just dissolves.
It completely unravels.
Okay, so when I hear about this immense pressure on the ecosystem, my immediate thought is a question of adaptation.
Sure. Nature adapts, right?
Right. If the bees, both managed and wild, suddenly vanished, couldn't the other incidental pollinators step up? You mentioned butterflies, hummingbirds, beetles, even certain species of bats.
I did.
So in the absence of competition from bees, couldn't they expand their roles and just take over the pollination shifts?
It is a perfectly logical assumption, but ecologically, it is a near impossibility.
Really? Why?
First, as we established with the electrostatic charge in the pollen baskets, the physical efficiency of a bee moving pollen is orders of magnitude higher than a butterfly casually sipping nectar.
Right, the butterfly isn't trying to collect it.
Exactly. But more importantly, natural systems are locked into highly specialized evolutionary packs. Millions of years of coevolution have created lock-and-key mechanisms between specific plants and specific pollinators.
The cocoa plant is a perfect example of this lock and key mechanism, actually.
Oh, it's a great example.
If you are listening to this and you love chocolate, you need to understand how fragile its existence is.
The cocoa tree is incredibly specific. Its flowers are tiny, highly complex, and point downwards. Bees are actually too large, or lack the specific anatomy, to navigate the internal structure of a cocoa flower effectively.
So bees don't even pollinate chocolate.
No. The plant relies almost entirely on a specific, tiny insect called a midge fly to perform the pollination.
Okay, so if the generalist bees disappear, the entire surrounding ecosystem begins to starve. Why couldn't the midge fly just keep pollinating the cocoa plants? Like, they're still there, right?
Because ecosystems are deeply interconnected, if the generalist bees vanish, the massive foundational layer of the food web collapses.
Right, the trophic cascade.
Exactly. The remaining specialist pollinators, like those midges or specific hummingbirds, are already fragile populations. As the surrounding flora dies and the environment degrades, the immense stress of a collapsing ecosystem would quickly wipe out those isolated specialist networks.
They just get caught in the crossfire.
They cannot fill the void left by the bees. They would be swallowed by the resulting ecological vacuum.
So if the stakes are this incredibly hyatrophic cascade, global hidden hunger, the unraveling of the physical environment, we have to look at what is actively killing them.
And the numbers are horrifying.
They really are. We aren't just talking about a slight dip in populations. Data from agricultural centers like Heifer Ranch indicates that the American bumblebee population has plummeted by 90% in just 2 decades.
A 90% loss of a foundational species in 20 years is a biological siren blaring at full volume.
Yeah, that is a full-blown collapse.
And we track this collapse very closely in the commercial sector through winter colony losses. In commercial beekeeping, the sustainable threshold is an 18.7% winter loss.
18.7%.
Right. If a beekeeper loses fewer than 18.7% of their hives over the winter, they can reasonably split their surviving hives in the spring, introduce new queens, and maintain their operational numbers.
Just normal business operations.
Yeah, anything consistently above that threshold means the industry is actively shrinking.
And we have blown right past that 18.7% threshold.
We've obliterated it. In recent years, national averages for winter losses have hovered between 30% and 42%.
Double the threshold.
And in certain regions, following particularly harsh environmental stressors, commercial beekeepers have reported catastrophic, devastating die-offs of 60% to 70% of their colonies in a single season.
What is driving these massive die-offs? Because the university research and the UN reports, they don't point to a single smoking gun. They outline what they call a synergistic threat matrix.
Yes, a matrix of threats.
It is a combination of overlapping crises. Let's examine the mechanics of these threats, starting with the chemical front. Pesticides, specifically a class called neonicotinoids.
Neonicotinoids, or neonics for short, are currently the most widely used class of insecticides in the world. They are chemically related to nicotine,
Okay.
but what makes them uniquely dangerous is that they are systemic.
What does systemic mean in this context?
Well, unlike older pesticides that were sprayed topically on the leaves and could potentially wash off in the rain, neonics are used as seed coatings or applied to the soil. The growing plant absorbs the chemical into its vascular system.
Oh, so it's inside the plant.
It integrates it into every single tissue, the stem, the leaves, and crucially, the pollen and the nectar.
So how does it actually kill the bee? Because I mean, it's designed to kill a pest insect that is actively chewing on the leaf, right?
Yeah.
Not a bee taking a microscopic sip of nectar.
That is exactly the issue. The dose the bee receives in the nectar is usually sublethal. It doesn't cause them to immediately drop dead inside the flower.
And what happens?
Neonics are neurotoxins. They bind to the acetylcholine receptors in the insect's central nervous system, causing overstimulation and eventual paralysis. But in sublethal doses, it induces severe neurological damage.
Brain damage, essentially.
It scrambles the bee's memory, its learning capacity, and its internal navigation systems.
So a bee flies 3 miles from its hive, lands on a treated flower, takes a sip of nectar, and suddenly its internal GPS goes entirely offline.
Yes. It essentially induces a state of profound disorientation. The bee forgets how to navigate back to the hive.
That is so sad.
It is. It flies aimlessly until its energy reserves are depleted, and it dies of exhaustion or exposure alone in the field.
So the hive loses a worker.
The hive doesn't just lose an experienced forager, it loses the vital protein and carbohydrates that forager was carrying back to the developing larva. So the hive starves.
The second major threat in the matrix is habitat loss, specifically the creation of agricultural food deserts.
Food deserts, right.
When I drive past massive, sprawling farmlands, I see millions of plants. It looks like a paradise for a pollinator. Why does the data call these areas food deserts?
It is an optical illusion of abundance. Consider a commercial almond orchard in California's Central Valley. It spans hundreds of thousands of acres.
Okay, huge scale.
For a brief, intense 3-week window in February, when the almond trees blossom, it is indeed an absolute paradise of nectar and pollen.
Just endless food.
But the moment those blossoms drop, the environment drastically changes. Modern industrial agriculture relies heavily on herbicides to maintain completely bare earth between the rows of trees. There are no weeds, no wild dandelions, no patches of clover.
Just miles and miles of sterile dirt and green leaves.
Exactly. For the remaining 49 weeks of the year, that massive geographical area offers absolutely zero food for a pollinator. If a wild bee attempts to establish a nest there, it feasts for 3 weeks and then starves to death.
Because there's nothing left.
They have systematically eradicated the diverse year-round floral forage that wild bee populations require to sustain themselves through changing seasons.
The third threat introduces a biological antagonist that sounds like a monster from a science fiction film. The Varroa destructor mite.
It is arguably the greatest biological threat facing the western honeybee today. Varroa destructor is an external parasitic mite.
Like a tick.
Very similar to a tick. It originally evolved on the Asian honeybee, which has natural defenses against it, but it jumped to the western honeybee, which has virtually none.
What are the physical mechanics of a Varroa infestation? How does a tiny mite take down a superorganism?
The mite physically attaches itself to the body of the bee, often wedging itself between the overlapping chitin plates of the bee's abdomen where the bee cannot groom it off.
Ugh, sounds awful.
For a long time, it was believed the mite simply drank the bee's hemolymph, which is the insect equivalent of blood. But recent entomological research has revealed something much worse.
Worse than drinking its blood.
The mite actually liquefies and consumes the bee's fat body tissue.
What is the fat body tissue?
It is an absolutely critical organ. The fat body functions essentially as the bee's liver and immune system combined.
Oh, wow.
It stores energy, detoxifies chemicals, and produces the antimicrobial peptides the bee uses to fight off infections. So the mite is literally draining the bee's immune system.
Like a dirty hypodermic needle bypassing the exoskeleton armor.
That is a brutally accurate analogy, because as the mite feeds, it acts as a vector, injecting potent viral pathogens directly into the bee's open circulatory system.
Like mosquitoes transmitting malaria.
Precisely. And the most devastating of these is deformed wing virus, or DWV. When a mite infects a developing bee pupa with DWV, the bee emerges from its cell physically crippled.
Deformed wings.
Its wings are shriveled, useless stubs. It can never fly, it can never forage, and the healthy bees in the hive will quickly recognize it as a liability and drag it out of the hive to die.
That's survival math again.
A severe Varroa infestation left untreated will collapse an entire healthy colony of 50,000 bees in a matter of months.
The final major pressure point in the synergistic threat matrix is climate change. But looking closely at the research, the primary threat isn't just that it's getting too hot for the bees to survive, though extreme heat waves do cause severe physical abnormalities in developing larvae.
Right, heat is bad, but it's not the main mechanism.
The truly devastating mechanism is a temporal disruption called phenological mismatch.
Phenology is the scientific study of cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena.
Like when things happen in nature.
Exactly. When plants bud, when animals migrate, when insects emerge from hibernation, especially in relation to climate. For millions of years, solitary bees and native plants have perfectly synchronized their life cycles.
They're on the same calendar.
A specific species of wild bee is genetically coded to emerge from its winter slumber at the exact moment a specific species of local wildflower bursts into bloom.
They are perfectly synchronized dance partners.
Exactly. But climate change violently alters the tempo of the music. And the problem is that the plant and the bee are listening to two different environmental cues.
How so?
A plant might trigger its blooming cycle based on ambient air temperatures or the accumulation of sunlight hours. A ground nesting bee, however, might trigger its emergence based on the deep soil temperature reaching a certain threshold.
Okay, so the air warms up faster than the dirt.
Right. When we experience an unseasonably warm, false spring, the snow melts early, the air warms up, and the flowers bloom 2 or 3 weeks ahead of schedule. But the soil deep underground remains cold, so the bee stays asleep.
And by the time the soil warms up and the bee finally emerges from hibernation,
The dance floor is completely empty. The flowers have already bloomed, the petals have fallen, the nectar and pollen are gone.
oh, that's tragic.
The bee emerges exhausted from months of hibernation into an environment completely devoid of the food it needs to survive its first few days. That temporal disconnect is phenological mismatch, and it leads to massive localized starvation events.
When you lay out these 4 threats, the neurotoxic scrambling from neonics, the starvation of food deserts, the immune collapse from the veromite, and the timing disruption of climate change, it's like watching a boxer taking a series of brutal combination punches.
It really is a barrage.
Like, a bee colony might actually be robust enough to survive a mild exposure to a pesticide, but that chemical exposure weakens their immune system. Then, because they live next to a monoculture food desert, they are malnourished, which weakens them further.
Exactly.
So when the veromite bypasses their armor, that is the knockout blow, they are fighting a war on 4 fronts simultaneously.
They are compounding synergistic stressors, and what is vital to understand is how human industrial agriculture actively accelerates this collapse.
Because of the massive farm.
Because we have created these massive sterile monocultures like the almond orchards, we require intense, massive bursts of pollination for very short windows.
Since there are no wild bees left there to do it.
Right. To achieve this, commercial beekeepers have to load millions of hives onto the backs of flatbed semi-trucks and drive them across the country. They follow the bloom from almonds in California to apples in Washington to blueberries in Maine.
Subjecting an insect colony to highway speeds and constant vibration for days at a time has to induce incredible stress.
The nutritional and transport stress is immense, but the larger ecological danger is the congregation.
The mixing of all these different hives.
When you gather 2 million commercial beehives from all over the country and place them in a single California valley, you create an unprecedented superspreader event. Mites, fungi, and novel viruses spread rapidly among the densely packed commercial hives.
Like a giant waiting room full of sick patients.
Exactly. And then, and this is the tragic crossover point, those infected commercial bees go out to forage and interact with wild native bees on the same flowers.
They leave the pathogens on the flowers.
Yes, it is a biological spillover event. The commercial bees act as a vector, transmitting devastating diseases into fragile wild ecosystems that have absolutely no evolutionary immunity to them.
Which brings us to what is undoubtedly the most paradigm-shifting realization in all of the source material we reviewed.
The big misconception.
Yes. When the public hears about these dying colonies and these massive threats, the immediate cultural response, the hashtag, the bumper sticker, the marketing campaign, is Save the Bees.
Yep, it's everywhere.
But entomologists, like Dr. Sammy Ramsey featured in the National Geographic docuseries, point out that our entire cultural panic is largely focused on the wrong insect.
It is the most pervasive, well-intentioned misconception in modern environmentalism. We have to draw a stark, definitive line between the concept of save the bee singular and save the bees plural.
Break down that distinction. Who is the singular bee?
When the average person says save the bees, the image in their mind is the western honeybee, Apis mellifera.
The classic bee.
They picture the neat white wooden boxes, the beekeeper in the protective suit, the hexagonal honeycomb, the jars of golden honey. But the critical fact that is often omitted from the conversation is that the western honeybee is not a wild animal in North America.
It's not native.
No. It was brought over by European colonists in the 1600s. It is, by every definition, an agricultural animal. It is livestock.
It is the insect equivalent of a dairy cow or a farm chicken.
Precisely. And here is the shocking truth that runs counter to the entire Save the Bees narrative. Globally, the total number of managed honeybee colonies is actually increasing.
Wait, how is that mathematically possible if commercial beekeepers are experiencing 40% to 60% winter die-offs?
Because they are livestock managed by human intervention.
Yeah.
If a commercial beekeeper loses half of their hives over a brutal winter, they don't just accept the loss.
They breed more.
In the spring, they systematically divide their surviving healthy hives in half, order new, artificially reared queens through the mail, introduce them to the split hives, and aggressively feed them sugar syrup to build their inventory back up to operational levels.
So it's an industry replacing its stock.
It costs the beekeeper an immense amount of money, labor, and stress, which makes the agricultural industry highly volatile. But the species itself, Apis mellifera, is not at any risk of biological extinction.
So the panic over the honeybee going extinct is entirely misplaced.
It is. The honeybee is safe because it has a multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry ensuring its survival. The true crisis is that the massive, highly publicized focus on the agricultural honeybee completely masks a silent, catastrophic extinction event happening in the shadows.
The wild bees.
The rapid die-off of the roughly 20,000 diverse wild native bee species globally.
That is where the wild bird and chicken analogy perfectly illustrates the absurdity of our actions. We see a decline in the wild pollinators, the ecological equivalents of the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, and the wild songbird, and our response is to breed billions of domestic agricultural honeybees and release them into the environment.
And doing so is actively, measurably harmful to the wild populations we should be protecting.
How does adding honeybees hurt the wild ones?
When an enthusiast places a couple of honeybee hives in an urban park or near a wild meadow to help the environment, they are introducing an incredibly aggressive, highly efficient foraging machine into a fragile ecosystem.
They outcompete them.
A single honeybee colony houses 50,000 workers. They systematically strip the local landscape of nectar and pollen, directly outcompeting the native, solitary bees for dwindling floral resources, leaving the wild bees to starve.
And as we discussed earlier, they spill over diseases into those wild populations. Why are these wild, unseen species so crucial? If the honeybee is so efficient, why can't we just rely entirely on them for our agriculture?
Because honeybees are generalists. They're decently good at pollinating a wide variety of plants, but they are masters of very few.
Jack of all trades, master of none.
Exactly. The IPBES data reveals that a staggering 80% of global crop pollination is actually attributed to just 2% of wild bee species.
Wow, that's a huge ratio.
The wild bees are doing a massive amount of the heavy agricultural lifting. And because of millions of years of specialized coevolution, wild bees possess physiological mechanisms that the honeybee simply does not have.
The tomato plant is a classic example of this limitation, isn't it?
It is the perfect example. Tomatoes, along with eggplants and potatoes, do not present their pollen openly for any insect to just brush against. The pollen is locked tightly inside a tubular structure called the anther.
So it's hidden.
A honeybee can land on a tomato flower, but it cannot access the pollen.
How does the plant ever reproduce then?
It requires a highly specialized physical action called buzz pollination or sonication.
Sonication, like sound waves.
Essentially, yes. Certain wild native bees, specifically bumblebees, will fly to the tomato flower, unhinge their flight muscles from their wings, clamp their jaws onto the flower, and violently vibrate their thoracic muscles at a very specific high frequency.
That is wild. They unhinge their wings.
Yeah, that intense vibration resonates through the flower and literally shakes the locked pollen free, allowing it to shower over the bee's body.
And a honeybee simply cannot perform buzz pollination.
They do not possess the anatomical capability. If we allow wild bumblebees to go extinct, commercial greenhouse tomato production would literally require humans to walk down the rows with electric vibrating wands, manually vibrating every single flower to release the pollen.
Doing the bee's job by hand.
The labor cost would be astronomical, making a simple bottle of ketchup incredibly expensive.
So why are the wild bees, the bumblebees, the mason bees, the sweat bees, why are they so much more vulnerable to the synergistic threat matrix than the honeybees? Why are they silently disappearing while the honeybee numbers rebound every spring?
The primary reason is that they do not have a human caretaker. When a wild bee encounters a food desert, there is no beekeeper to provide it with a bucket of sugar syrup.
They're on their own.
When a wild bee encounters a novel pathogen, there is no human applying a miticide treatment to save it. But the most significant factor driving their localized extinctions is their unique nesting architecture, which puts them directly in the crosshairs of human development.
When I think of a bee nest, I picture a paper hive hanging from an oak tree branch or a wooden box in a field.
That is true for social bees, but the vast majority of wild bee species, roughly 70% of them, are solitary, and they nest underground.
They live in the dirt.
Yes. A single solitary female bee will emerge in the spring mate and then spend days laboriously digging a tiny deep tunnel directly into bare earth.
Just digging a hole.
She hollows out small subterranean chambers, provisions each chamber with a precisely formulated loaf of pollen and nectar, lays a single egg on it, and seals the chamber with mud or leaves.
A pollen loaf. That's cute.
It is, but she will never meet her offspring. That larva will develop underground for nearly a year before emerging the following spring.
So they are entirely dependent on the physical, undisturbed microarchitecture of the topsoil.
Entirely. So when human urban sprawl paves over a natural meadow to build a suburban subdivision or a parking lot, or when industrial agriculture runs a massive steel tiller deep into the soil to prepare a field for planting, we are not just destroying flowers.
We're crushing the nurseries.
We are instantly, mechanically annihilating entire generations of ground nesting bees developing in the soil. They require undisturbed earth and highly specific native wildflowers within a few hundred yards of their nest to survive. We are systematically eradicating both.
Man, this has been an incredibly heavy journey. We have peered over the edge into the abyss of a trophic cascade, we've unraveled the forefront war of the threat matrix, and we've recognized the tragic, silent extinction of 20,000 species of wild native architecture holding our world together.
It's a lot to process.
But the stated mission of this deep dive was to replace panic with awareness. And the profound good news threaded throughout all of this research is that because this is an ecological system, the solutions are not highly theoretical or decades away.
No, they are highly actionable right now.
We can rewrite the initiative. Let's look at the macro level first. How is the agricultural world stepping back from the edge?
The paradigm shift gaining momentum in the agricultural sector is a movement toward regenerative agriculture. For decades, industrial farming has been an extractive process,
Taking nutrients out.
taking nutrients out of the soil and artificially replacing them with chemical fertilizers. Regenerative farming is about designing agricultural systems that actively rebuild and repair the surrounding ecosystem while still producing high crop yields.
How does that apply to the threat of the steel tillers ripping up the ground nesting bees?
It directly addresses it through no-till or reduced-till farming. Instead of turning over the soil between growing seasons, regenerative farmers utilize specialized equipment to plant seeds directly into the undisturbed earth.
So the soil stays intact.
This preserves the delicate subterranean microarchitecture, allowing those solitary bees to complete their life cycle safely below the surface.
What about the massive monoculture food deserts? How does a farmer grow 1,000 acres of almonds without starving the bees for 49 weeks of the year?
By utilizing cover crops and hedgerows, instead of leaving the earth bare between the rows of primary crops, regenerative farmers will plant dense cover crops like clover, vetch, or alfalfa.
Which provides a massive, continuous floral resource for the pollinators.
It breaks the famine cycle, and it provides a massive benefit to the farmer because cover crops actively pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it into the soil, acting as a powerful, free, natural fertilizer.
A win for the farmer, a win for the bees.
Exactly. They also maintain deep, wild borders of native shrubs and flowering weeds around the perimeter of their fields, known as hedgerows.
And the economic data supporting this is fascinating. I was looking at the research from the Chico State Organic Farm Studies, and the financial incentive for the farmer is undeniable.
Well, the numbers are clear.
They found that organic farms situated immediately adjacent to preserved natural habitats or robust hedgerows often receive 100% of the required pollination services entirely for free from the wild, native bees living in those borders. They don't have to spend a dime renting commercial honeybee hives.
It is the ultimate ecological win-win. By providing habitat, the farmer secures free, highly efficient, specialized pollination, increasing their crop yields, while actively repairing the local biodiversity.
Which is amazing.
But it is crucial to recognize that the solutions are not solely the responsibility of rural farmers. Urban environments have a massive, surprisingly effective role to play.
That feels incredibly counterintuitive. How can a concrete jungle, a city full of asphalt and skyscrapers, be a sanctuary for a fragile insect ecosystem?
Because urban environments, despite the concrete, are largely exempt from the massive aerial industrial spraying of agricultural pesticides like neonicotinoids.
Oh, right. We aren't crop dusting cities.
Exactly. If managed correctly, cities can be chemical safe havens. Forward-thinking urban planners are recognizing this. They are integrating expansive green roofs on commercial buildings, transforming abandoned lots into native wildflower meadows, and altering municipal landscaping policies to allow parks to grow a little wilder.
It's about creating interconnected biological corridors through the concrete. But that brings us to the ultimate pragmatic question for the person listening to this right now.
What can they do?
Yeah, you are likely thinking, I am not a commercial almond farmer in California. I don't dictate EPA policy on neonicotinoids, and I am not a city planner. What can I, as an individual, do today, right now, to actually move the needle and help the wild native bees?
The beauty of ecological action is that scale is relative. To a solitary bee with a flight radius of a few hundred yards, your backyard or your balcony is their entire universe.
That's a great way to put it.
The sources outline highly effective, immediate actions. First, examine your own footprint. If you have an apartment balcony, plant a window box with diverse native flowering plants. Every single square foot of untouched forage acts as a vital refueling station.
And if you have a traditional suburban yard,
Reconsider the cultural obsession with the perfectly manicured, sterile green grass lawn. A grass lawn is a biological desert. A highly impactful movement to participate in is Mow May.
I genuinely love the concept of Mow May. It is the perfect environmental excuse to be incredibly lazy about your yard work for an entire month.
It is surprisingly effective laziness. By simply locking the lawnmower in the shed for the first few weeks of spring, you allow the early emerging plants like dandelions and creeping clover to bloom.
Which people usually hate.
To a human eye, a dandelion might be an unsightly weed ruining a perfect lawn. But to a wild bumblebee queen who has just emerged exhausted and starving from months of underground hibernation, that dandelion is a desperate lifeline.
It's their first meal.
It is the crucial first meal that gives her the energy to establish a nest and begin the next generation.
What about hydration? We spent a lot of time talking about the friction of flight and them acting as tiny static dust mops. They have to get thirsty out in the heat.
Hydration is critical, especially during high summer heat waves. A very simple, actionable step is to create a bee bath.
Like a bird bath, but smaller.
Yes. Place a shallow dish of water in your garden or on your balcony. But there is a crucial mechanical detail. You must fill the dish with pebbles, marbles, or small stones so the water barely covers them.
Why the pebbles?
Bees breathe through tiny openings on the sides of their bodies called spiracles. They cannot swim, and they will easily drown in deep open water. The pebbles provide a safe, dry landing pad for them to stand on while they lean down to drink.
Beyond altering our physical spaces, we can alter our economic impact. We participate in the global food system every time we go to the grocery store.
Absolutely. Your economic choices dictate agricultural practices. Whenever possible, choose to buy local organic produce.
Vote with your wallet.
Choose to buy honey directly from local sustainable beekeepers rather than mass-produced supermarket blends. By doing so, you are actively diverting your money to fund the farmers and beekeepers who are utilizing regenerative agriculture, avoiding toxic pesticides, and preserving the hedgerows. You are casting a direct financial vote for the health of the ecosystem.
And finally, there is an action that requires zero money, zero yard space, and zero physical effort. A fundamental shift in empathy.
Empathy is key.
When you are sitting in a park or on your patio and a bee flies near you, try to suppress the instinctual panic. Do not reach for the rolled-up magazine. Do not flail your arms, and do not reach for the bug spray. Just sit still and observe it.
Empathy is perhaps the most powerful conservation tool we possess. When you take the time to understand the complex mechanics of what an animal is actually doing, you replace instinctual fear with profound respect.
Which perfectly brings us back to the macro perspective of this entire journey, and a brilliant insight from filmmaker James Cameron featured in the docuseries.
Oh, I love that quote.
He noted that in nature, animals are the protagonists of their own stories. We just need to understand what motivates them. A wild bee is not a pest trying to ruin your picnic. It is a solitary mother, exhausted and statically charged, working herself to the absolute limit of her brief life to provision a hidden underground nursery for a generation she will never live to see.
It's quite poetic.
And in performing that deeply personal task, she is unknowingly holding up the cathedral of our global ecology.
It is a profound and necessary shift in perspective. We began this deep dive looking at the microscopic physics of a tiny insect gathering pollen, and we have traced that single action outward to the structural integrity of the global economy.
To the foundational nutrition of human civilization and the survival architecture of terrestrial ecosystems.
We have discovered that these creatures are not simply honey factories for human consumption. They are the essential architects of biodiversity.
We've dismantled the myth of the four-year apocalypse, but fully recognized the very real, terrifying slow-motion crisis of hidden hunger and trophic cascades.
And most importantly, we have learned that the true front line of this ecological battle isn't found in the white wooden boxes of managed livestock, but in the undisturbed topsoil, the native weeds, and the complex lives of the 20,000 species of wild bees fighting to keep the wild world alive.
I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over. Early in our conversation, we explored the concept of the honeybee colony functioning as a superorganism.
Right.
It operates as a practically perfect sustainable society. Every single member works selflessly for the collective. They calculate and manage their resources meticulously to survive the harshest winters without depleting their environment.
They adapt, they endure, and their daily, relentless labor literally breathes life and reproduction into the world around them.
It is deeply humbling to think about.
It truly is. If an insect, an animal with a brain roughly the size of a sesame seed, operating entirely on chemical cues and instinct, can achieve perfect sustainable harmony with its environment, what is fundamentally stopping humanity, with all of our massive intellect, our technological marvels, and our profound self-awareness from doing exactly the same?
That is the ultimate question we have to answer. Thank you for being part of this deep dive. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden systems of our world, make sure to follow and subscribe. Because as we've seen today, not with fear, but with understanding, and not with panic, but with deep awareness, sometimes the smallest things in our world hold the biggest truths. Keep observing, keep questioning, and we'll catch you next time.